Moscow, winter, 1977. A gas station on the outskirts of the city, one of the handful in the entire capital that pumped fuel reserved for foreign cars, which meant it was one of the only places in the Soviet Union where an American could sit alone in the dark without a minder standing 3 feet from his door. An embassy car pulls in, engine ticking, breath fogging the windshield. A man appears at the window out of the cold, middle-aged, glasses, an ordinary Soviet raincoat that has seen too many winters. He taps twice on the glass. A folded scrap of paper slides through the gap, and before the American can even think to roll the window down, the man is gone, swallowed back into the dark between the pumps. Nobody in that car knows yet what they are holding. Nobody knows what it will cost. He comes back. Not once, not twice. Over the following months, he approaches Americans again and again, at that same gas station, on quiet streets near the diplomatic compound, anywhere he can find a car with foreign plates and a driver alone. He has no way of knowing which of these people are ordinary embassy clerks and which are CIA officers working under diplomatic cover. He simply keeps trying, 5 times, 6 times, maybe more, always the same small folded note, always the same handful of words. I have access to something valuable. I want to talk. Some nights the note is refused before it even reaches a hand, brushed off a windshield onto the wet asphalt as the car pulls away. He picks it back up. He waits for the next car. There is no glamour in it, nothing that looks like the spy novels, just a tired man in the cold, trying again and again, to give away something that could get him killed. And every single time, the answer that comes back from the American side is the same. Ignore him. Walk away. Do not engage. This was not caution for its own sake. Months earlier, a Soviet source run by the CIA inside the Foreign Ministry, a source the agency had spent years carefully cultivating, had been unmasked and cornered by the KGB, and had bitten down on a suicide pill hidden in a pen rather than be taken alive. The wound from that disaster was still raw inside Moscow Station. And history had taught the CIA a harder lesson still, one that went back further than anyone in the embassy that winter had personally lived through. The KGB had run so-called dangle operations before, planting an eager Soviet volunteer in front of an American officer for the sole purpose of catching him breaking Soviet law, filming it, and using the tape to expel him and humiliate his government in the world press. 2 decades earlier, a walk-in claiming to be a Soviet official had turned out to be exactly that kind of trap, and it had cost an American officer his career and his freedom of movement in the country for good. A stranger tapping on your car window in Moscow was not an opportunity. It was, by every rule Langley had written in blood, a trap waiting to spring. So, for the better part of a year, a man who would go on to hand the United States some of the richest military secrets of the entire Cold War was turned away, ignored, ghosted, by the very people he was trying to give it to. He did not stop. And that, in the end, was the detail that changed everyone's mind. A KGB dangle plays the part he's told to play and then quietly withdraws when the mark won't bite. There is no percentage in a controlled agent burning himself in public over and over for a year with nothing to show for it. This man kept coming back, month after month, with no handler pulling strings behind him, no script, nothing to gain from a rejected approach except the very real risk of being caught red-handed by his own government's watchers. Somewhere inside Moscow Station and back at Langley, officers began asking a different question. What if this wasn't a trap at all? What if it was real, and they were about to lose the single most valuable volunteer of the Cold War purely out of fear? There was something else, too, that nobody in that embassy could have guessed from a folded note and a stranger's face at a gas pump. This was not some junior clerk chancing his arm. This was a man who, by every outward measure, had already won the life the Soviet system had to offer. Decades of seniority, a defense industry salary, a security clearance most of his countrymen would never even be told existed. Men like that did not throw notes through car windows. That, too, was part of what eventually made the CIA look twice. In January of 1978, after months of note after note pressed through car windows, the CIA finally decided the risk of saying no again outweighed the risk of saying yes. A Russian-speaking case officer made contact. What came back in that very first real exchange stopped Moscow station cold. This was not a disgruntled clerk with second-hand gossip. The man proved who he was the only way that mattered, with details about Soviet radar and aircraft systems so specific, so technically exact, that no outsider could have invented them. Analysts checked what he offered against everything the agency already had, cross-referencing his claims with fragments gathered from other sources over the years, and every thread lined up. This was a man who worked inside one of the most sensitive military design bureaus in the entire Soviet Union. A man with a security clearance that put him within arm's reach of the blueprints for the radar systems flying inside every front-line Soviet fighter jet. His name was Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev. And over the next 7 years, he would hand the United States a haul of secrets so vast and so precisely aimed at the weapons systems America most needed to understand that intelligence officers would later struggle to put a dollar figure on it at all, before settling finally on a number in the billions. Even after that first exchange, the CIA did not simply take him at his word and relax. Acceptance did not mean trust, not yet, and maybe not ever completely. For months afterward, handlers kept testing him almost as carefully as they had once refused him, folding small verification questions into ordinary meetings, watching for the tiny inconsistencies that separate a real engineer from a well-briefed plant, sending back requests for details only the genuine article could possibly answer, and waiting, each time, to see whether the answers still lined up with what outside experts said was physically true. Every one of them did. Somewhere in that process, the fear that had kept the agency ignoring him for a year quietly gave way to something else entirely. The dawning realization of exactly how much they had almost thrown away. One analyst who reviewed those early pages back in Washington would later describe staying up half the night rereading a single translated report, doing the arithmetic on what it meant for aircraft the Pentagon had not yet built, and coming away certain of one thing above all else. If this man was real, he was about to change what the United States Air Force thought it knew about its own survival. Adolf Tolkachev was, on the surface, one of the most unremarkable men in Moscow. Middle-aged, soft-spoken, a lifelong engineer who had spent decades at the Scientific Research Institute of Radio Engineering, an institution known by its shorthand, Phazotron, one of the crown jewels of the Soviet military-industrial complex, the design bureau responsible for the radar and avionics fitted into the Soviet Union's most advanced fighter aircraft. He was not a general, not a defector in waiting with a diplomatic passport, not a disillusioned party functionary looking for an exit visa. He was a working radar engineer with decades of seniority and a security pass that let him walk, day after day, through a building full of the exact secrets the Pentagon most wanted and least had. Picture that ordinary working day, because it is the whole disguise. A senior engineer arrives at a guarded institute gate each morning, presents a pass a guard has waved through 1,000 times before, and disappears into a building of drafting rooms and locked file cages, one specialist among hundreds. He eats in the same canteen as his colleagues. He signs out classified material against his own name in a logbook, as the rules require, and signs it back in the next day, as the rules also require. Nothing about the rhythm of it ever changes. That is precisely what made him invisible. Not a disguise built for the purpose, but a whole unremarkable career, real and earned, that no one at Phazotron had any reason to look at twice. Even the building itself gave no hint of what it held. From the street, Phazotron looked like any other gray Soviet research institute, a slab of concrete and small windows behind a checkpoint fence, indistinguishable to a passerby from 100 other bureaucratic addresses in that part of Moscow. Only the guards at the gate and the men who worked inside knew that the drawings moving through its corridors could decide, in a real war, which side saw the other first. To understand why that access mattered so much, you have to understand what the United States did not yet know. A year before Tolkachev's first note landed on an American's lap, a Soviet fighter pilot named Viktor Belenko had defected by flying his own MiG-25 interceptor to Japan, handing Western intelligence its first real look inside a frontline Soviet fighter, and what they found startled them. The aircraft was cruder than feared in some respects, built with vacuum tubes rather than the sleek microelectronics American designers assumed the Soviets had already mastered. It was a relief, and it was also a warning. Because everyone in Washington understood that the MiG-25 was already old news, and that the Soviet Union was racing to field a new generation of interceptors and fighters, aircraft with genuine look-down, shoot-down radar, finally capable of finding and killing a target flying low against the clutter of the ground, precisely the capability American bombers and cruise missiles had always depended on the Soviets not having. Belenko had shown the West yesterday's airplane. Tolkachev was about to hand them tomorrow's. The problem those older radars had was simple physics, and it had kept American bombers safe for a generation. A radar beam pointed downward from a fighter, hunting for another aircraft skimming low over open country, could not easily tell a plane from the ocean of clutter bouncing back off hills, trees, and the earth itself, like trying to hear one whispered word inside a stadium roar. The whole Western strategy of low-altitude penetration, the entire premise behind decades of bomber and cruise missile design, rested on the bet that Soviet radar could not solve that problem. Tolkachev's documents proved the Soviets were solving it, describing the new signal processing and phased array designs meant to filter the whisper out of the roar. Feeding systems bound for aircraft that would go on to be known in the West by names like the MiG-29, the Su-27, and the long-range interceptor that would become the MiG-31. Planners revising the routes for American low-level bombers and the release points for their cruise missiles were, in effect, redrawing those maps around a single Moscow engineer's photographs. Engineers working on the next generation of American combat aircraft, wrestling with exactly how much a plane's radar signature needed to shrink to stay invisible, now had real Soviet numbers to design against instead of worst-case guesses. For years, NATO planners had been trying to answer that single question. Can they see us now? Largely through guesswork and fragments. Now, for the first time, someone was going to hand them the real blueprints, page by photographed page. Why would a man like this, settled, senior, invisible, with everything to lose and, on paper, nothing obvious to gain, spend 7 years risking his life to burn it all down from the inside? The answer had almost nothing to do with money, though money would matter too. It had to do with a grave, and a name, and a silence that had sat in his household for years before he ever said a word about it. Tolkachev's wife, Natalia, carried a family history that was not spoken of loudly in the Soviet Union of the 1970s, but was never forgotten either. Her mother had been swept up and executed during Stalin's Great Terror of the late 1930s, one of hundreds of thousands of ordinary Soviet citizens shot on the strength of a denunciation, a quota, or nothing at all. Her father had been sent to the camps. This was not distant history to the Tolkachev household. It was a wound that had shaped an entire family, quietly, for a generation. The kind of loss the Soviet state expected its citizens to absorb, bury, and never mention again. Especially not a man holding a top security clearance in a defense design bureau. Tolkachev absorbed it instead into something colder and more patient, a considered, adult engineer's hatred of the system he served every single working day. He was not a dissident who marched or signed petitions. That path led straight to a labor camp and helped no one. He chose a different kind of resistance, one built entirely on the very access the state itself had given him. He would use the regime's own secrets to arm the regime's enemy. It was revenge conducted with drafting tables and camera film instead of slogans, and it would take him 7 years to spend it fully. None of that fury ever showed on the surface. To the colleagues who sat across the drafting room from him for years, he was simply a competent, unremarkable senior engineer, a man who complained about the same things everyone complained about and asked after their children at the New Year holiday like anyone else. He learned to carry the whole weight of what he was doing without so much as a change in his morning greeting at the institute gate. That, too, was a kind of tradecraft, and he had mastered it before the CIA ever taught him a single trick of the real kind. But Tolkachev was not a martyr playing only for principle, and it would be wrong to make him one. He wanted money too, substantial money, banked and waiting, enough to change his family's life and secure his son's future. He asked for it plainly, and negotiated for it the way he negotiated everything, itemizing what he wanted the way he itemized a radar spec. Sums set aside in an account back in the United States he could never touch while he still lived in Moscow, since a radar engineer suddenly spending Western currency was a radar engineer inviting his own arrest, and smaller, careful deliveries of rubles and Western goods he could actually use without drawing notice. He asked for particular medicines, for phonograph records, for small comforts a Phazotron salary alone could never buy, the kind of things that said, quietly, that his family's life had improved, without ever saying why. At times he pressed his handlers on matters that had nothing to do with tradecraft at all, and everything to do with an ordinary father's worries, hoping the right word from the right quarter might smooth his only son's path into a good university and a life freer of the compromises he himself had made. It was an uneasy, very human combination. Cold political fury sitting right alongside a practical demand to be paid exactly what his information was worth, penny by ruble. The CIA agreed to both, eventually setting aside an account that would grow over the years into several $1 million he was never able to fully collect, and it made him, in the plainest sense, one of the most valuable assets the agency had ever recruited, before he had even handed over a single page. Now came the harder problem. How do you run a spy inside the most watched city on Earth for 7 straight years without ever once getting him caught? Moscow in the late 1970s and early 1980s was, for an intelligence officer, the single most hostile operating environment on the planet. The KGB's second chief directorate blanketed foreign diplomats with surveillance as a matter of routine, cars trailing embassy vehicles, watchers posted near diplomatic housing, phones assumed tapped, apartments assumed bugged, hotel rooms assumed wired down to the light fixtures. A single American officer suspected of intelligence work might have a dozen KGB watchers rotating through shifts around him on any given week, on foot, in unmarked cars, in the windows of buildings he passed every day without ever learning which ones held a watcher and which did not. CIA officers under diplomatic cover lived their entire posting inside what the agency itself called the Moscow Rules, an unwritten discipline built from decades of hard experience about how and whether it was even possible to meet an agent inside the Soviet capital without being seen at all. Officers brought their families to that posting and raised children inside it, sent them to embassy schools, hosted dinner parties for other diplomats, all while carrying underneath the ordinary texture of a foreign posting, the knowledge that a single missed step on a Moscow street could end a human life that was not their own. It was a strange, split existence to live for a 2- or 3-year tour. Cocktail receptions and school recitals by day, and by night, alone in a car with the radio on to cover the sound of a conversation that was not happening, watching mirrors instead of the road. A single meeting could take an entire evening to set up and less than a minute to execute. An officer preparing to meet Tolkachev might spend hours driving and walking a deliberately meandering route through the city, a surveillance detection run, doubling back through metro stations, riding a tram 3 stops past his own destination and doubling back on foot, pausing at a shop window not to look at the goods inside, but to study the reflection of the street behind him, cutting suddenly down an alley near a department store simply to see who, if anyone, followed the turn. Only when an officer was reasonably certain the KGB team assigned to him that night had lost the thread would the actual exchange happen, and even then it might last only seconds. A brush pass on a dim street, a package left behind a loose brick or a radiator pipe at a prearranged dead drop. A chalk mark on a lamppost, or a strip of tape on a mailbox, meaning simply, signal sent, signal received. There was no long conversation over coffee. Some meetings were barely a conversation at all, just 2 people passing close enough on a sidewalk for a hand to move. There were nights it very nearly went wrong. On more than one occasion over those 7 years, an officer working his route toward a scheduled meeting felt the hair go up on the back of his neck for no reason he could immediately name. A car that had passed twice, a pedestrian whose pace matched his own turn for turn, a figure loitering near a metro entrance a beat too long. On one such night, an officer aborted a planned exchange within sight of the drop itself, walking straight past the signal site without so much as a glance, circling back through 3 more stations and going home with the package still in his coat rather than risk it. Whether the danger that night was real or only the ordinary paranoia that Moscow bred into every foreign officer stationed there, no one could ever say for certain afterward. That was the nature of the work. You rarely learned in the moment whether your instinct had just saved an agent's life or cost the operation nothing at all. Tolkachev, waiting on his end for a signal that never came, had no way of knowing which either. He simply went home and tried again another week. Tolkachev's side of it was, if anything, more dangerous than his handlers. He could not simply walk out of Phazotron carrying an armful of classified blueprints under his coat. Some documents he was permitted, under strict internal rules, to take home overnight for legitimate work. And it was in those narrow windows, a few hours at his own kitchen table at night, with his wife aware of at least some of what was happening in her own home, that he photographed page after page, using subminiature cameras the CIA had supplied him, engineered to fit inside ordinary objects, and to produce usable images of dense technical drawings under nothing more than a desk lamp. The finished film had to travel back out through the same narrow channel everything else did, hidden inside hollowed household objects, passed hand to hand at a brush contact lasting less than a second, never once trusted to the ordinary post or to anything that might be opened by a curious customs officer. Other material he could not remove at all and had to reconstruct afterward from memory, sketching from recollection the schematics he had studied inside the building hours earlier, checking and rechecking his own draftsman's hand against what he remembered seeing on the page. Over the following years, he would hand over thousands of pages of documents and photographs covering radar design, weapons guidance, and the avionics of aircraft the West had never before been able to properly examine. He asked for one more thing, and the CIA gave it to him without much argument. A way out on his own terms, if the moment ever came. Hidden inside an ordinary pen was a means to take his own life rather than be taken alive by the KGB. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the calculated decision of a man who understood precisely what interrogation in the basement of the Lubyanka would look like, and who had already decided, years in advance, the terms on which he was and was not willing to live through it. For years, remarkably, none of it slipped. Officers rotated in and out of Moscow Station on relatively short postings, in part so that no single face spent too long becoming familiar to KGB watchers who studied the small diplomatic community with real, patient attention. And with every successful exchange, the value of what Tolkachev was delivering kept climbing higher still. Analysts back in Washington, poring over his material, began to reshape entire assumptions about Soviet air defense, recalculating exactly how vulnerable American bombers and cruise missiles really were to the newest Soviet radars, adjusting the electronic countermeasures fitted onto American aircraft, refining precisely how low and how fast a plane needed to fly to slip beneath a Soviet interceptor's gaze, and how much warning its crew would actually have before a missile found them. Weapons programs already on the drawing board in the United States were quietly revised in light of what one Moscow engineer was smuggling out of a design bureau a few photographed pages at a time. Later assessments of what his intelligence had saved in avoided research and development costs alone would run into the billions of dollars, a number that, decades later, would earn him the nickname history remembers him by. The billion-dollar spy. None of it meant anything until it was understood. Film came back from Moscow inside diplomatic pouches sealed against inspection, and from there it traveled to the Air Force's own Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where specialists in Soviet aviation spent weeks translating dense Russian engineering notation into English, and English engineering questions back into the exact follow-up requests that would go back to Moscow on the next exchange. It was a strange, patient assembly line stretched across 2 continents and an ocean of secrecy. An engineer photographing blueprints at a kitchen table in Moscow at midnight, and technicians half a world away, months later, redrawing an American radar warning circuit because of what that film showed. Neither side of that assembly line ever saw the other. Neither needed to. But the very success of the operation was its own kind of danger. The more Tolkachev delivered, the more precisely Soviet counterintelligence would eventually be able to see the shape of the leak, once someone finally started looking in the right place. And someone was about to look in exactly the right place, not because of a single mistake Tolkachev made, and not because of a slip inside the walls of Phazotron, but because of 2 men on the American side of the operation who had never once met him, and who were about to sell him anyway. The first was a young CIA officer named Edward Lee Howard. In the early 1980s, Howard was selected for one of the most sensitive assignments the agency had to offer, a posting to Moscow Station, where, as part of his preparation, he was read into the details of the agency's most prized ongoing operations inside the Soviet Union, including the case of the radar engineer who had been walking blueprints out of Phazotron for years. Howard trained for months to take up that post. He learned the tradecraft, studied the files, absorbed the entire shape of exactly what the agency had running inside Moscow, down to the details of how meetings were arranged and signaled. Then, before he ever set foot in the Soviet Union, it fell apart. Routine pre-deployment screening turned up a pattern the agency could not overlook. Heavy drinking, petty theft, deception on his own polygraph examinations. In the spring of 1983, Edward Lee Howard was fired from the CIA. He never made it to Moscow. But he walked out of Langley carrying, in his memory alone, the outline of one of the agency's most valuable Soviet sources. And he walked out angry, financially strapped, and convinced the agency had wronged him. Within roughly a year, struggling and nursing a grievance that had curdled into something colder, Howard made contact with Soviet intelligence. What exactly he handed over, and precisely when, would only become fully clear to American investigators much later, after a KGB officer who briefly defected to the United States that same year pointed the FBI toward a former trainee who had never served in Moscow but somehow knew far too much about it. By the time agents closed in on Howard's home in New Mexico in September of 1985, he was ready for them. Using a crude trick, a spring-loaded dummy rigged to sit up in the passenger seat of his car, as if he were still there while his wife drove, Howard slipped his own FBI surveillance in the dark and vanished, eventually surfacing, like the men he had betrayed to reach it, inside the Soviet Union itself. But the timing of what he sold, long before any of that unraveling, lines up with a chilling precision. Sometime in 1984 into early 1985, the KGB began receiving information from an American source who had never once set foot inside the Moscow embassy, but who knew in outline exactly what the CIA's most sensitive Moscow operation looked like from the inside. He was not the only one selling secrets that same year. At almost the same moment, a serving CIA officer named Aldrich Ames, not a fired trainee nursing a grievance, but a mid-level counterintelligence officer still walking the halls of Langley every day, made his own approach to Soviet intelligence, for reasons that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with money. Ames was drowning in debts he could not explain on a government salary, remarried to a woman with expensive tastes, and increasingly desperate. On the 16th of April, 1985, he walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and handed over an envelope identifying a portion of the CIA's own network of Soviet and Eastern Bloc sources. A single, devastating delivery made simply for cash. Further deliveries followed over the months and years after, eventually naming dozens of people the United States had spent years quietly cultivating inside Soviet institutions in exchange for a fortune that would run into the millions of dollars before he was finally caught nearly a decade later. It would come to be remembered as one of the worst betrayals in American intelligence history, and 1985 itself would later be nicknamed grimly the Year of the Spy, a single terrible summer in which one Soviet-run source after another, in city after city, simply stopped answering, arrested, or worse, with no pattern the agency could yet explain. Even the outward signs of what Ames was becoming were, in hindsight, almost comically visible. Within a couple of years, he was paying cash for a house well beyond a government salary and driving a new Jaguar to work at Langley. And for a long time, almost nobody thought to ask how. It would take years of quiet, agonized internal investigation, officers combing back through travel logs, meeting schedules, and old suspicions long after Tolkachev himself was gone, before the CIA finally understood that a mole inside its own walls had been part of the reason. In the summer of 1985, none of that reckoning had happened yet. All Moscow Station knew was that something in the city had changed, and nobody could yet say what. Two men, two entirely different motives, one bitter and fired, one comfortable and greedy. Neither had ever met Adolf Tolkachev. Neither knew him as anything more than a code name in a file cabinet, and between the two of them, inside the same 12-month window, they closed in on a man who had spent 7 years successfully outrunning the entire Soviet security state, undone not by his own tradecraft, but by betrayals from inside the very agency that was supposed to be protecting him. Through the spring of 1985, the signs in Moscow began to shift, subtly at first. Meetings that had once gone smoothly now carried a harder edge of tension. Officers running their surveillance detection routes reported instincts they couldn't quite justify on paper, a sense that the ordinary background noise of the city had changed pitch, that a face seen twice in one evening was one time too many. Back in Washington, the men who carried ultimate responsibility for the case felt the same unease rising without yet being able to name its source. The chief of the CIA's Soviet division at Langley and the chief of Moscow station itself had both staked a great deal of their own careers on Tolkachev's survival, and both read the same thin, ambiguous field reports that spring and came away with the same knot in the stomach that something, somewhere, had turned against them. At Phazotron, Tolkachev himself later told his handlers he had begun to feel watched in ways he could not name, nothing concrete enough to act on, no evidence he could point to, only the accumulated weight of 7 years spent waiting for exactly this feeling to arrive. Nothing was provable. Nothing was certain enough to call off the operation outright. But the machinery that had protected Tolkachev for 7 years was starting, quietly and invisibly, to fail. And neither the man risking his life inside Phazotron nor the officers running him through the Moscow dark yet knew exactly why. On the 13th of June, 1985, a young CIA case officer named Paul Stombaugh set out into Moscow for what was meant to be a routine operational meeting with Tolkachev, the kind of careful, practiced exchange the two sides had executed dozens of times over 7 years. Stombaugh ran his surveillance detection route with the same discipline every officer before him had used, watching, doubling back, testing whether the city behind him was clean. It looked clean. It was not. At the moment of the meeting, the street around him came alive. KGB officers closed in from every direction at once, men who had clearly been waiting, positioned, briefed in advance on exactly who was coming and why. Stombaugh was seized on the spot, and so was Adolf Tolkachev. Stombaugh carried a diplomatic passport. Within a short time, he would be declared persona non grata and put on a plane out of the country, protected by the one thing his agent never had. Adolf Tolkachev had no such protection, and no chance left to reach for the one he had asked for years before. He was pulled from that street into the custody of the KGB, and the 7-year run of the billion-dollar spy ended in the space of a few seconds, on a Moscow sidewalk, with no note left to slip through a car window and no gas station stranger left to ignore. He was held, interrogated, and tried behind closed doors, convicted of treason against the Soviet state. In the fall of 1986, Adolf Tolkachev was executed by firing squad. The engineer who had handed the United States the inner workings of Soviet air defense for 7 straight years, and who had done it first for a dead mother-in-law and a father sent to the camps, and only afterward for the money he would never live to spend, was gone. Aldrich Ames would not be identified as the mole inside the CIA for nearly another decade, arrested in 1994 and sentenced to life in an American federal prison, where he remains. Edward Lee Howard lived out his years in Soviet, then Russian, exile, never brought to trial in the country he had betrayed, until he was found dead at his home outside Moscow in 2002. Adolf Tolkachev left behind a mountain of stolen secrets that had already reshaped, invisibly and permanently, the balance of power in the sky.